Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our monthly seminar from the Vidal Sassoon Center for the Study of Antisemitism. This is unusual as our monthly seminars go for a number of reasons, and we've moved it to this room because we anticipated, I think correctly, that there would be a few more people than we normally get. The subject, as you probably know, is issues raised by the Passion, anti-Semitism, and the freedom to tell our Christian story. And I'm particularly delighted to be able to welcome to the Hebrew University this morning, Father Michael McGarry, who will be the first speaker, who is the Rector of the Tantur Ecumenical Institute. Father McGarry is originally from LA, and he studied for the priesthood for the Paulist Fathers in Baltimore and Washington. He did his graduate work in theology at the University of Toronto, St. Michael's College. And he's also studied here at the Hebrew University, Jewish Studies. I first heard about Father McGarry in the context of Jewish-Christian dialogue. I heard him speak very movingly here once on the subject of the Shoah, and indeed he has written about Christology after Auschwitz. I should also mention that he serves, and that may be also relevant at some point in our discussion this morning, that he served on the advisory committee to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops on Catholic-Jewish relations. This morning we'll proceed as follows. Father McGarry will talk to us for about half an hour. Then David Satran, who I will introduce when he begins to speak, and he's from the Hebrew University. David Satran will respond. Since David has to go for reasons unavoidable due to our own schedules shortly after, don't panic. We will have a discussion with you for at least half an hour, and we will be able to air all of the sensitive and I think controversial issues which will undoubtedly arise. So without further ado, please welcome Father McGarry.
Before I begin, I want to pass out these pages. I brought 40, so if you're married or have a significant other, share it, or for the same dormitory.
Don't get too liberal.
Great. Nice. Must be perfect. Sometimes when I've said before I begin I'm going to pass out, people laugh. It's crowded. It's serious issues. Maybe we shouldn't laugh. A very famous African-American Christian preacher, before he began his sermon, said, let me say something before I start talking. So let me say something before I start talking. What I passed out is something I wrote with the help of Ron Cronish of the Interreligious Fortean Council in Israel, which you may read at another time, or things really slow down, you can read while I'm talking. But it's one expression of some things I'll be saying this morning. I must say at the outset, however, that I have not seen The Passion of the Christ, so that I've entitled my reflections this morning, Issues Raised by the Film. And these issues can be talked about even if one has not seen it. I've had some opportunities this week to see it, and even now there's a DVD one can buy for a few shekels of the film, and I'll mention later why I haven't seen it. Indeed, these issues are ones I have been dealing with, thinking about and writing about over the last 30 years as I work for better Jewish-Christian relations, primarily in the United States, but now here in Israel and Palestine. There are issues that have been dealt with We worked with Rabbi Leon Kliniki, Rabbi James Rudin, then of the Anti-Defamation League and the American Jewish Committee, respectively, on the Passion Play phenomenon, primarily in Ramagau in Germany, but also the Passion Play phenomenon in the United States, which is an extraordinary phenomenon in terms of the actual numbers of people who see Passion Plays on a yearly basis. Is a multiple of the relatively few people who see the Oberammergau play. So this is a very important issue that I have had some experience with over the last 30 years, primarily the last 20 years. And also I've been working on the areas of preaching, how to preach as a Catholic or a Christian preacher without being anti-Semitic. And I belong also to a group called the Christian Scholars Group on Judaism and the Jewish people, among whom were the scholars who first obtained a copy of the script. Now, this happened about a year ago. The text was, it's actually a very interesting story in itself. It illustrates two things. But the text, the original text of the script was given to the Christian Scholars Group, which includes Protestants and Catholics and with some Jewish input. Eugene Korn, then of the ADL, and Dr. Paula Fredrickson of Boston University. And then it was evaluated, and it seemed to be very, very dangerous with lots of problems, and I'll talk about some of those problems in a moment. But then the people from the Mel Gibson's production company claimed that the script had been stolen, and they threatened and indeed started a lawsuit against the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, and that started the first of many brush fires, one might say, that brought an awful lot of publicity to the movie. And as one looks back, the second issue that it raises, the leak of this particular text to the Christian Scholars Group, with then their disagreement with it and warning that this has to be changed in many ways because of its potential for anti-Semitic fomenting and provocation. One begins to see, as part of the whole story, the incredible genius of the Mel Gibson people to get publicity for the film for the last year and a half. A year and a half ago, he could not get a distributor for the film, and now everybody wants a piece of the action. And I don't think that was simply by accident. One might even say, to use a metaphor, that Gibson and his people found a violin in many, many parts of the world, the Jewish world, the Catholic world, the Protestant world, and began to play that violin very professionally, even unknown to those violins being played. And the result, while not very pleasant music, was very effective and, one has to say, very lucrative. So we at the Christian Scholars Group put out, as a result of seeing what was coming down the highway, a warning sheet, or a questions to ask before you see the Mel Gibson film, and this has been distributed in the United States to churchgoers of the more central and liberal variety. And so finally, with Rabbi Ron Kronish, I've written the piece which I've just passed out, which has been distributed by email throughout North America, Europe, and to Israel, probably primarily to people who need it the least. Nonetheless, these sorts of things need to be done because as the train was leaving the station a year and a half ago, one could see what was going to happen down the track, and we needed to get on board, so to speak, with what is all the fuss about, because a lot of people needed to know what the fuss was about. So that's kind of my own personal engagement with this issue, and it has been over a number of months and in many ways over a number of years. And so it's from that background now that I wish to address the issues that arise from the film. So I've stopped saying something, now I'm going to start talking. There are many issues that arise from this film. One doesn't have to be Jewish to be offended by this movie, either for its possible anti-Semitism or for its violence. Conversely, One can be Jewish and see this movie is not anti-Semitic. I quote David Klinghoffer. Before saying what is wrong and what is right with Mel Gibson's The Passion of Christ, let's get out of the way the question that is on everybody's mind. Now that the film is open, it will become clear to regular viewers who have heard of the controversy, furiously fanned by those enterprising fundraisers of the ADL, that no, the film is not anti-Semitic. It does not show Jews per se in a uniquely nasty light. Depicting the final 12 hours of Jesus' life, it portrays all humanity except for the few earnest followers of Jesus in an exceptionally ugly fashion. The Roman soldiers who mercilessly, endlessly scourged Jesus with clawed whips, laughing and wiping the drool from their mouths the whole time, are no less disgustingly portrayed than the proud, callous, foolish Jewish priests who demand that the Roman governor take the torture to the next level, crucifixion. So says Jewish film critic David Klinghoffer. Catholic priest and a fellow friend of mine, Frank Sabate, wrote, Mel taught me that the Romans tried to save Jesus from the evil Jews. I learned that Pilate was a really nice guy, and his wife was a saint who even helped marry the mother of Jesus. My friend and colleague, already mentioned in a private conversation before this, James Carroll said, The Passion is a Roman Catholic. The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson is an obscene movie. It will incite contempt for Jews. It is a blasphemous insult to the memory of Jesus Christ. It is an icon of religious violence. The crucifixion is depicted as a triumph of sadomasochistic exploitation. Andrew Sullivan, a Roman Catholic essayist, said, the movie The Passion is pure pornography. In an interview I watched on CNN, Rabbi Mark Gilman claimed, having seen the film, that it's time for the American Jewish community to be mature enough to allow the Christians to tell their story without by reflex claiming anti-Semitism. And on the same program, Abraham Foxman of the Anti-Defamation League said, all the Jews were bad guys and all the Romans were good guys. So the first issue is you don't have to be Jewish to be offended, but because you're Jewish doesn't mean you're going to see the film as anti-Semitic. The second issue I raise, that I think that the film raises, is how does one account for these differing assessments of the anti-Semitic content of Gibson's film? And here I ask to your indulgence, because I'm going to tell a little bit of a crude story that for me has been swirling around as a way to explain this phenomenon. Standing in line at the supermarket, waiting to check out her things at the checkout stand at the supermarket, is a woman. And up walks a drunk who says to the woman, you must be single. And the woman says, why do you say that? And he says, because you're ugly. Now that's the crude story that my brother sent me on email. I was thinking about this crude story. Then I thought, what if in that crude story, behind the woman, a young girl says, after the crude drunk says, you must be single because you're ugly. The young girl says, she's not ugly, she's my mother. Now that casts a whole different way of seeing this scene. And what if one had of this crude scene only a photograph of it? We would probably all say, too, a woman is ugly. We might not say she's single. That's a really sexist and heterosexist thing to say. But it does say something, if we had a soundtrack, to hear the young girl say, she's not ugly, she's my mother, we might begin to say, something else is going on. And to me, this story kind of helps me understand why Jews and Christians can come away from the same film with very different expressions. In other words, anti-Semitism to a degree is in the eyes of the beholder. Or put in another way, one will be greatly influenced in assessing the content of this film by the questions that one brings to the film. That is, if one goes into the movie with the question, is this movie anti-Semitic? I think that we will emerge from the theater saying, yes, this movie is anti-Semitic, especially us in this room. What if we start showing the film right now? That would be our first question. Is the movie anti-Semitic? Someone asked me if I was going to see the movie this week. I had, as I mentioned already, opportunities to see it. You can buy the DVD for a few shekels. My first answer was, I don't like Jesus movies in general. Whether it's Jesus Christ Superstar, The Last Temptation of Christ, Pasolini's The Gospel According to Matthew. I don't like them in general. But if I was in the United States, I probably would see it as a kind of pastoral responsibility because everybody's asking about it. But I don't feel quite the same responsibility to hear. But if I go to the film, to be sure, my question is going to be, is this movie anti-Semitic? And I think I will walk out of the film, yes, this movie is anti-Semitic, because people whose judgment I trust have seen the film and said that many of the Jewish characters other than Jesus, his followers, and some of the crowd, are depicted in kind of stereotypical tropes that one can find in Middle Ages passion plays and other sorts of locations for typically anti-Semitic stereotypes. One local priest here in Jerusalem suggested, well, why don't we have a showing of the film with equal numbers of Jews and Christians and discuss it afterwards? I had mixed feelings when I first heard that. I said, gee, that sounds fair. But the more I thought about it, I said, I don't think that's a good idea. Because the only reason we're going to see this movie is we're going to see it to answer the question, is this movie anti-Semitic? But what if you entered the theater with the question, how much has Jesus Christ done for me? How much does Jesus Christ love me? How much is Jesus Christ willing to do for me? Now, I suspect that virtually nobody in this room would enter a theater to see The Passion of the Christ with that question in his or her mind. But by the testimony of many people coming from the film, we've heard people say exactly that. I never realized how much Jesus had done for me. I never realized how much Jesus loved me. I never realized how much Jesus is willing to do for me. Furthermore, if one has been educated into the Christ killer myth, the idea that the Jews at the time of Jesus killed him and therefore became Christ killers or Messiah killers or perpetrators of deicide, killing God, I think that if one hasn't been educated in that way, one will not see it in the movie either. I remember talking with a colleague of mine when we used to do some things together in the United States, Dr. Michael Berenbaum, who for a time was a program director at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He taught at Georgetown University, and he taught theology as a Jewish professor. And he had a class of about 60 students, he was telling me, and he was talking about Christ killers and how the effect of being Christ killers had a terrible effect on Jews, and the Christ killers this, Christ killers that. And some student raised his hand and said, what is a Christ killer? And Berenbaum was shocked by this. He said, well, how many here have ever heard the word Christ killer? Nobody of the 60 had heard it. He said, well, how many of you had 12 years of Catholic education? About 50%. How many have had 8 years of Catholic education? About 80%. And he was shocked by this. He said, what has been something of a cliche in Jewish Christian education and in Jewish understanding is how Christians are taught about their faith. We thought you all understood what a Christ killer was and that you all believed in it And I'm here to clean you of this terrible slander against our people. So in some ways, what we have here is a phenomenon of people going to a movie with different questions, and therefore I suggest that's why they can come out with different experiences. Some seeing as simply an anti-Semitic tract, and others seeing as a great expression of their faith in Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior, as their friend, as their Savior. And New York Jewish Week, in its assessment of the film, decided to do a kind of, as they very humorously put the article, searching for the Jewish weapons of mass destruction. And so the reporter, very inventive, went to a number of bars thinking he would find a lot of Irish Catholics there. That's a little bit of a stereotype, isn't it? But he did find them there. And he asked a number of them, including a recent immigrant from Dublin, 10 years, what did she thought of the movie? She said, I love the movie. I didn't take it from the point of view of Jewish people bashing Jesus Christ. I took it from the point of view of what human beings do to other human beings. There were even Jewish people in the movie that, when Jesus was brought into court, said, this is not right. I love Mary, the mother of Jesus, the love that was between the two, between mother and son. So the interviewer, Pastor Warren, said, well, what did you think of the Jews in the movie? And she replied, do you know what? I came out with a headache because I was weeping so much. I was so devastated that we, notice the pronoun, that we could do this to somebody, Jesus, watching the way he was whipped. I came out of the movie very upset, very sad. I didn't get the controversial part of it at all. Jesus is born into the world a Jew. Granted, it depicted Jewish people as being very harsh. That's without a doubt. But I know a lot of people, not Jewish, who are like that too. Would you have, and then the interviewer said, would you have thought about the Jewish aspect if it weren't for the controversy? She thought a bit, no, I don't think so. Back in Dublin, she was taught, we crucified Jesus Christ, not the Jewish people. And so, within a certain way or track of teaching Christianity, that is in some ways very mainstream Christianity, we have been taught that the Jews didn't kill Jesus, we did. Now this is a very difficult sort of doctrine to convey to people who are not in the Christian club, but it is part of mainstream Christian teaching. And so so part of my answer to the question, how can people have different answers to the same experience of the film, is that when you go in saying, my sins killed Jesus, Jesus is my personal Lord and Savior, how much did Jesus do for me? When you have that as your filter or your frame, then you'll come out, this is incredible what Jesus did for me. Now the fifth issue I want to raise, that's raised by the film, is the fixation on the ugliness of passion, as particularly in the blood and gore and violence. It's another reason I don't particularly want to see the film. I live around too much violence. I see it every day, and it's nothing that I can stomach, even, or especially with a soundtrack. I hate violence that has music behind it. That has to, I have to say, by sidebar, that's why I finally went to see Saving Private Ryan when I was told that the assault on the Normandy beach was done without music. I think that any violence in a movie with music glorifies it. I think that's what happens in the Gibson film. I haven't seen it. But there is a strain, particularly in Roman Catholicism, of being fixated on blood and gore. If you've ever been to Portugal and gone into a Catholic church, or Spain, or parts of Latin America, or the Philippines, one sees an incredible fixation on the ugliness of violence and blood and gore. Now, there are historical reasons for that, partially because the introduction of putting a body on the cross itself, which is the difference between a cross and a crucifix. A cross simply has the cross without any body on it, and you'll notice in Catholic churches you'll see a body on the cross. That's called a crucifix. In the Catholic tradition, this was not the usual way you would see Jesus depicted in a church until the 13th or 14th century, when with the experience of the plague, people are dying off right and left, that the emergence of a artistic depiction that Jesus is the one who suffered not only for me, which is already pretty well impacted in the tradition, but alongside of me, began to have a very strong emotional resonance within the Christian community. And so Gibson's fixation on this does have a particular Roman Catholic pedigree of being focused in Southern European crimes, I would say primarily, where the blood and gore has had a historical resonance with regard to the Black Plague and with regard to the blood that is needed as a satisfaction to God, as a sacrifice itself. You know, both from our traditions, that sacrifice to God is something that appeases God. So, if we are not aware of that experience in Christianity, particularly in certain parts of Roman Catholicism, then we can see the focus on blood and gore as simply sadism, and we can really miss something. It is an ugly film for that reason, but you'll hear people immediately say, she's not ugly, she's my mother. He's not ugly, he's my Savior. And when you hear this from evangelical Christians in particular, who don't have the same pedigree about blood and gore, but have a very keen sense of what Jesus Christ has done for me and my sins, it might from the outside look very sick, very sadistic, certainly almost incomprehensible from a Jewish perspective. But I think that until we begin to understand how the suffering of Jesus, and even in the most grisly sense, way depicted, as it's given something of a documentary fashion in film, resonates with evangelical Protestants, we will not be able to discern the difference between seeing simply an ugly person in a checkout stand and that ugly person is not an ugly person, that's my mother. That kind of tension. Another issue raised by the film is the Jewishness of Jesus. Now, I haven't seen too many pictures of how Jesus looks, but one of the problems with the Passion narratives in the past has been depicting Jesus as being very Northern European, whether it's Max von Sydow or Charlton Heston lookalikes or whatever it might be. Most recently, on the heels of the Passion, was an ABC. ABC is an American television network made-for-TV movie called Judas. Now, this film got a bit of a bounce from the Gibson film, to be sure. And I remember seeing this shown as a video at the American Academy of Religion in the United States 2 years ago. And many of the scholars came and they said, you know, that's all we need is one more brown-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. Doesn't look like he came from the Middle East at all. And the producer who was there said, well, I have to tell you, in dealing with the people, the executives at ABC, they said it had to be a very handsome young man because the demographics of people who watch made-for-TV movies are women between the ages of 18 and 35. And we need to sell certain things if we're going to have a made-for-TV movie. There are lots of issues that come in trying to depict Jesus, and one of them is demographics to sell whatever it needs to sell. But I would suggest that as we see, if we see this movie, we need to be aware that the questions people raise as they bring to a movie like Judas or The Passion come from very different places. There are some other issues that are raised that I would call intra-Christian issues, although some of these are intra-Christian issues. There are numerous historical inaccuracies in the film by Gibson, according to my colleagues in the Christian study group, scholars group who studied the text. But this is, to me, not such an important issue, because on the one hand, the depiction is not historical because it Some say it departs from what's in the Gospels. But on the other hand, scholarship has told us over the last number of years that the texts themselves are theological efforts to understand what happened to Jesus a number of years before they were written, and at a time when Christians were beginning to be persecuted by the Romans. And so the part of Pilate himself was downplayed, and the culpability of the Jews was overplayed precisely to escape some of the retaliation by the Romans. And thirdly, an intra-Christian problem is who killed Christ. Now, I'm instructed by one of my colleagues who's gone before us in Dept, Roy Eckhart, who said people who keep asking the question, who killed Christ, sometimes have a certain interest in keeping the pot stirred and boiling. I think Ellis Rifkin, the great Pharisee scholar, got it right when he entitled his book, a very fine book I found that, What Killed Christ, not Who Killed Christ. And in that book, he points out a number of historical factors at the time of Jesus that came to play on his being killed. But I want to go back to that story by, excuse me, I want to quote my friend Jim Carroll on this point, that when the gospel stories were written, they were written within a Jewish community, some of whom, the majority of whom, did not believe that Jesus was Messiah, and the minority of whom did, but who both had just gone through the trauma of the destruction of the temple. And as Carroll points out, by the age of Constantine, Christians had misremembered their own origins. The Passion narrative, instead of being taken as an argument within the Jewish community, as it was when the Gospels were written, was read as an argument against it. The Christ killer lie had been exposed by modern scholarship, by modern history. Once Christians know where the falsely anti-Jewish Passion story led, it is criminal for them to repeat it naively, whether from a pulpit or on a movie screen. And so I think that this particular historical problem within the Christian community is that we simply cannot just repeat what's in the Gospels and suggest A, that they're historical, or B, that if we tell they're not historical, that and we say what really happened, that we can avoid the problem of the anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish dimensions of the Gospels themselves. And that's the fourth intra-Jewish, intra-Christian problem, our own scriptures. This is an issue that's raised by the Gibson film, and I think that we in the Christian community need to address it. We cannot address it this morning. We have only a few more minutes. But I do want to raise it as an issue that we Christians need to address. And I think that we as Catholics have begun to address it. And I'm happy to document that in a few moments, or if people ask about it. But I'm going to skip over that part for now. So what are we to do? Oh wait, a couple more inter-Jewish, inter-Christian problems. There's not enough resurrection in the film. There's not enough of Jesus' life in the film, and the preoccupation with violence. So what are we Christians to do? This is my conclusion. There's about 4 parts of the conclusion. Edward Flannery, the great historian of anti-Semitism, said on page 1 of his book, The Anguish of the Jews, "It is little exaggeration to state that those pages of history Jews have committed to memory are the very ones that have been torn from Christian and secular history books." So the first thing that we Christians need to do is education, and in this way, as an odd way, we can ruin the film for our innocent Christian brothers and sisters. Because I do believe that many Christians and many Catholics who go to this film are innocent of the history of Christian anti-Semitism and the use of the Passion stories in particular in terms of Passion plays and the effect they've had in fomenting anti-Semitism. And so I believe that we need, first of all, to educate our own Christian people. And I think that the Catholic Church in the United States has done this in an extraordinary way, not only over the last few weeks, but over the last few decades. Secondly, we Christians have a tremendous challenge before us in addressing the anti-Judaism, and I don't think it's anti-Semitism, that's up for argument, the anti-Judaism in the New Testament, which is a reflection of the polemics going on at the end of the first century. I entitled these reflections, Issues Raised by the Gibson Film, Anti-Semitism and the Freedom to Tell Our Christian Story. My first concern was and is anti-Semitism, the potential of any expression in our society to provoke or support Jew hatred. I believe that, as reported to me and as mentioned in many essays and reviews of the film, there are many dimensions which have a potential for anti-Semitism, but more so from what people bring to the film than what people see in it inherently. So I think that we Christians need to educate about anti-Judaism, and I think we Catholics are doing it. But the third thing we need to do is that we need to be very sensitive in the way we engage our Christian brothers and sisters, whether you're Jew or Christian, I think you can say that, because this is a tender and loving kind of enterprise and not a search and destroy. One does not do this by pummeling people as they come out of the film weeping about how much Jesus has done for them by telling them that they have just supported anti-Semitism. I think it's done in dialogue and respect for another's background, as I have tried to sketch concerning certain European origins of bloody representations of passion and Protestant evangelical expressions of Jesus as my friend and my personal Lord and Savior. Fourthly, I think that what are we to do is to be very careful about depictions of the passion that we have some control over. As you know, Mel Gibson was raised as a Catholic, but as you may not know, I didn't know until 2 days ago, I'm living with a brother who from Australia who was running the school where Mel Gibson went to school. His father took him out of the school because the school was teaching the Second Vatican Council. As you know, some of you know that Mel Gibson is quite proud of the fact that he doesn't accept the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, and he's innocent of those, as maybe is clear in the movie. No. But in a post-Holocaust and post-Vatican II world, I think that we need to be very careful about how we depict passion. But as Mark Gellman, the rabbi from the United States in the CNN interview already referred to, said, I think it's time for Jews in the United States and perhaps elsewhere to reach a maturity to allow us Christians to tell our story, but with your help, oddly enough. I reflected that, to me, Rabbi Gellman had a very generous attitude that it's time for Christians, Jews, not to immediately say that when the Christians tell a story, it has to be anti-Jewish or it has to be anti-Semitic. And in the movie Judas, which I already mentioned as well, the ABC made-for-TV movie, the producer, Father Frank Desiderio, also Apollo's father and a colleague of mine, decided in telling the story of Judas, he took a lot of artistic freedoms in doing it. He says, whereas Judas refused to show his film to most Jewish leaders until it opened last week, Desiderio had a rabbi involved early on as a technical consultant to the film. Unlike The Passion, which puts most of the onus for Jesus' death on Jewish elders, Judas points the finger equally at Pontius Pilate, who is portrayed as a despotic ruler. The film also opens with a scene of a mass crucifixion, reminding viewers that Jews were persistently persecuted by the Romans. How would Gibson's film have been different if he had religiously Jewish observant colleagues as technical consultants? I think that the way Desiderio did Judas is the way that post-Holocaust, post-Shoah, and post-Vatican II official organs of the Church should do their depictions, but we still have a right and a freedom to tell our story. And we need to do it in a way that is not anti-Jewish and not anti-Semitic. And lastly, I think we need to say something about our local context. From what I've been reading in English language media outlets here and in talking with my Jewish Hebrew-speaking Israeli colleagues, some of the things that have been said in the Jewish press are incredibly anti-Christian, hateful, stereotypical, and prejudice of the most gutter sort. What are we as people who live in Israel to say about this? Well, I think it says what the same thing it says in the United States. It's that we Jews and Christians who live in Israel, particularly those who believe that we can live together as brothers and sisters, need to cooperate in educating our respective constituents about the other. And as Andrew Greeley, the priest sociologist in the United States, points out, one of the very interesting things that he says to Jewish audiences in the United States is if you want to counter anti-Semitism, the most efficient, cost-effective way is to give your money to Catholic schools. Because you can track the changes that the people least likely to be anti-Semitic are those people who've had the most Catholic education. So, I think that as we work together in this land together, as we get to know one another and get to know the good things that the Catholic Church has done, not without a lot of problems, not without a lot of improvement still needed, we can remember what James Baldwin, who some of you may not know, is an African-American writer in the United States, that we're talking about race relations there. As we get to know one another, Baldwin reflected, if I am not what you say I am, then you are not who you think you are. Maybe if we work together in this land to get to know one another, we would find out that we are not who we think we are, and you might find out you are not who you thought you were when you came in this room.
Thank you very much, Father McGarry, for those insights. And I'm now going to call on David Satran, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University. He was indeed the chair of that department for 6 years during the 1990s. He's also lived since. Yes, he survived it. And he's also been a visiting associate professor in Princeton and at Yale. I think, David, what we'll do is, since you will have to leave at 12, you'll respond for about half of an hour, and then we'll allow the audience to put some specific points to you so that we get the benefit of your response, and then you'll be free to leave, and Father McGarry and myself will carry on.
Thank you. Michael had suggested that I use to good advantage and to good effect the fact that I have to watch out sort of promptly at 12 in order to go and get ready for my class at 12:30, and use it to good advantage by storming out when one of the questions proved too provocative. I'll try not to do that, but if it happens, know that this is probably not to be taken at face value nor the way it appears. My response will, in fact, will be short, and I hope we'll be able to move on quickly to the questions and to some discussion. And I'll try, obviously, to stay on as long as I can. Short in part because Father McGarry has taken up so many of the points which seem to me salient, and I won't simply go over them or try to restate them in my own terms. It seems to me that many of them are out there for discussion already. Let me begin by saying, as Father McGarry did, that I have not seen the movie. I know that if one was sufficiently enterprising, one could have already. I don't feel a great desire to. I know I will at some point, but I think I'm going to let that time come in its own time. I'm not going to make great efforts to. Though I haven't seen the movie, I just, like many of us, I've been enormously involved over the last 2 or 3 weeks, downloading material from the internet and surfing in order to see how people react to the movie. And in fact, this is a case where reactions began before the event. People have been reacting, as Father McGarry said, for well over a year to a movie which hadn't yet been been shown, and I think one could probably fill a couple of volumes already on what's been written about the movie, much of it on the basis of barely having seen it, if at all. One of the most salient things, certainly one of the more disturbing things that's come out in the discussion both before the movie and certainly over the last month since it actually came out and has been screened, is the fact that an attack on the movie has been described or has been displayed as an attack on the Gospels or on Christianity itself. And this goes back to the question which Father McGarry raised of simply PR which has been very effective, PR which has been to a certain extent rather ugly, but PR which has certainly been used with its full force by the production team behind the movie. And this has been taken up, or this idea that any sort of attack or criticism of the movie is in fact an attack or criticism of what lies behind the movie. And what lies behind the movie may be taken as the Gospels, may be taken as Christian doctrine or belief itself, or may be taken as Gibson's own personal faith. And all of those have been part of this argument that the attack is actually an attack elsewhere. It seems to me that these have been used not only by members of the production team, but in fact by a large number of, for lack of a better term, I characterize them as conservative critics. And it seems to me with a great deal of cynicism for the most part. But I'd like to get back to that point as I go on. One of the offshoots of this attack on criticism, that is, the branding of any sort of criticism of the movie as an attack on, not the movie itself, but a series of other things, has been specifically focused on Jewish critics. That is to state that there's some illegitimacy in the Jewish criticism of the movie because it's an essentially, again, a Jewish attack on a number of things which are not Jewish in and of themselves, or which perhaps Jewish critics should be slightly more reticent to attack or speak out on. And again, it seems to me that there's an enormous amount of duplicity, perhaps even cynicism, in this framing of the question. And again, I'd like to get back to that in a couple of minutes. Finally, there seems to be some sense in which a criticism of the movie is being portrayed as a Jewish infringement, that is to the extent that criticism comes from Jewish quarters, as a Jewish infringement of, and if I might borrow for a moment the title, Michael, of your talk, a Jewish infringement of the freedom to tell the Christian story. And again, I'd like to explain why I don't think that's the case, and begin immediately by saying that there's obviously a perfect freedom to tell the story. And I think most critics, even the harshest critics of the movie or the screenplay that lies behind the movie, have been very quick to say that this isn't an attempt to say that there isn't a freedom to tell the story, but rather something else. And that something else I'd like to illustrate by just a short quotation from Mary Gordon, American novelist, American Catholic novelist, whose response to the movie was, I think, interesting, measured, if very critical, but includes the crucial sentence, to be a Christian is to face the responsibility for one's own most treasured sacred text being used to justify the deaths of innocents. And it seems to me the question is not the freedom to tell the story, but the freedom to tell the story responsibly. And I think that ties in very closely with the sort of things that Father McGarry was saying earlier. I'd like to frame the rest of my statements essentially around 2 points, and they're questions of faith and faithfulness and the relationship between them. Obviously, in a very real sense, the movie, as it's being presented before its appearance, and now that it has appeared, the movie is being presented as a statement of faith. There's something very personal about this movie, about this venture. It's Gibson's own statement or own understanding of the passion of the Christ. In a real sense, it's a personal statement of faith, in a way that perhaps other movies about Jesus or about the Passion were not. I'm to take a very famous example, perhaps a very notorious example, Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ, based upon the novel by Kazantzakis, is almost certainly not personal, or at least a personal statement, in quite the same way that I think Gibson's movie probably is. And I think it's important to make that distinction and realize that we are talking about a personal statement of faith. In a certain sense then, and I don't know to what extent Father McGarry would agree with this or not, but it seems to me to resonate with some of the things you raised. It seems to me a particularly faithless statement in the sense that Gibson is working outside of any tradition, or certainly working outside of the tradition in which he was initially raised. That is, the movie comes as a statement of faith, a personal statement of faith, and yet it comes as a personal statement which flies in the face of a great deal of traditional thought from that faith. Because it seems to me that the personal statement, one would hope that a Catholic filmmaker would make today, would in fact be informed by the efforts of the last 40 or 50 years. We're really coming up on the 40th anniversary now, next year, of Vatican II and Vatican II's revolutionary statements about the relationship between the Catholic Church and other religions. And many of those have been set down and worked out carefully, and perhaps the clearest document, and the one which clearly wasn't on the table of anyone involved with the production of the movie, was the criteria for the evaluation of the dramatizations of the Passion, which was produced by the Bishops' Committee for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs of the National Council of Catholic Bishops. And it seems to me in that sense there's something faithless about this attempt to make a statement. More troubling, it seems for us, and it seems to me the point at which we do want to dissect the movie more carefully, is on the question of faithfulness. And it seems to me that here the slide between a statement of faith and a faithful statement has been a rather slippery one. Because Gibson himself and those around him have portrayed the movie not only as a statement of personal faith, but in fact as a faithful statement of what, in fact, both is said in the Gospels, and therefore, by extension, what happened 2,000 years ago. Okay. In the words which have been quoted and undoubtedly misquoted, the movie portrays the events as they were, or it is as it was, in the famous words now that were attributed to John Paul II, and there is every reason to believe he did not say. There is a very real sense in which this movement from faith to faithfulness, or an attempt to say that the movie is faithful, in that sense, does deserve a very real scrutiny, both as Jews and Christians together. Father McGarry has already talked about some of the departures from the Gospels themselves. He's talked about some of the departures from what we understand of the history of the period. There's a really very real sense in which the movie is deeply unfaithful, to the extent that we've been told about it, to the extent that we've had an opportunity to learn about it, deeply unfaithful not only to the literary records which we have in front of us, in the way in which the Gospels are used, on a whole series of questions, and I won't go into it in any great detail, but unfaithful also to the best human efforts in the fields of understanding and knowledge. That is, the movie does not correspond to our own attempt to recreate or to understand what actually took place. A final point, moving on from the questions of faith and faithfulness, or perhaps faithlessness and unfaithfulness. The movie is clearly about blood. Okay, and the only thing I can say in this regard is what I've seen from the stills of the movie, and there are a sufficient quantity of stills of the movie out on the internet to probably say something fairly accurate about the nature of the movie itself. The movie really is a movie about blood. It's about a bloody Jesus. It's about the steps taken towards the bloodying of Jesus and the immediate aftermath of that process. The thing perhaps which struck me most in thinking about today and in preparing for today, and the preparation which seemed to me best and most sensible, was simply to go back and read the Passion accounts of the four Gospels, is the extent to which blood does not figure in the accounts of the Passion. It figures obviously in the accounts and in the first formative Eucharistic supper, in that first meal which sets the pattern, but it is not in the Passion accounts themselves. There's a very, very strong sense in which the blood of the movie is perhaps its least faithful aspect. Perhaps faithful in some sense, if one tries to turn it that way, to the reality of crucifixion, although then other questions come into play, and they're very real questions which people have raised. That is it really faithful to a crucifixion? And the answer, of course, is immediately no, because no audience would sit through the reality of a crucifixion. People would have turned away, they would have left the theater, they would have simply lowered their heads at a much earlier stage. What one is being treated to is a faithful cinematic version of what a crucifixion perhaps should look like for an audience. And so in that sense, the movie is not even faithful to the reality of the event, but it's certainly not faithful to the literary reality, which is what we have, the Gospels themselves. And in closing, I'd simply like to read the last 8 verses of what was the original ending of the Gospel of Mark. And I don't mean to be too mysterious about that, the original ending, but simply the understanding of most scholars that the final verses of the Gospel of Mark may be a later addition, and that the Gospel may in fact have concluded with verse 8 of chapter 16, and I'd like to read those verses 1 through 8. And when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices, so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, they went to the tomb when the sun had risen. And they were saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us of the door of the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone was rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were amazed. And he said to them, "Do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him as he told you." And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had come upon them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And obviously, as Prof. McGarry indicated earlier, perhaps what's most missing from the movie is the sense of resurrection, is the final movement in the story. But I don't want to go into that. It's obviously Gibson's privilege to focus on the passion. But it seems to me that from the gospel account, we can learn something, and that's from the reaction of the women who came to the empty tomb. And they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had come upon them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Obviously, silence doesn't go very far. Silence doesn't sell. Silence doesn't make a good movie. Silence probably even has its limited efforts here in the university as teachers. We can only use silence so far. But it seems to me that there's nevertheless something to be learned from it. And one would hope that with certain topics, and probably certain topics whose sensitivity is as great as that of the Passion, a sense of trembling and astonishment, of fear, which comes upon the viewer, should in fact be the salient one, and cause one to at least in some measure be silent.
So, you would like to start?
I promise to stay on a few minutes beyond that, so you can turn your fire to Father McGarry, and I won't flee that quickly.
Ask me
Okay.
questions on your fire. Right. Any questions?
On the other side.
Okay. Start with you.
I have a friend who saw the film in the States, and she emailed me and said that in the film, the Jews are speaking Aramaic with American accents, but they're speaking Aramaic. The Romans are speaking Latin, what they call street Latin, and everybody is reading these English subtitles. Do you think that a lot of people, especially the Christians who see the film, do not get the sense of what goes on because they have to read the English subtitles during the whole film?
I don't know of these cases.
I'm not sure. I mean, I know one of the issues that's simply worth mentioning, one of the issues that came up towards the release of the film was the whole question of probably the most famous, infamous, problematic verse in the gospel accounts of the Passion, namely, "May his blood be upon us and our children," the famous verse from Matthew 27. And I guess we could call it a concession or compromise that was made in the American release of the film, was the fact that that particular verse was said to have been excised from the film, and in fact, as people quickly reported, it's still in the film. It's in Aramaic in the background. It simply wasn't translated in the subtitling of the film. And people even said, well, what's going to happen when the film is released internationally? Well, then it will then be up to each particular producer or distributor in each country to decide whether he translates that or not. That may seem a somewhat marginal issue, but I'm not sure that it is. In fact, as some people have put it, and it's not an uninteresting question, given the nature of film today, films don't have one release. That is, in the way they used to. They used to come out to the movie theater, everyone went and saw that version of the film, and that's what there was. Well, we live in an age of DVD. We live in an age where films are not only distributed, but are in fact changed. Multiple versions are available of films, and some critics have raised the question that, what essentially are people going to be seeing in different parts of the world and in different communities? Are they all going to be seeing the same film? And the question raised whether Gibson's film doesn't have great capacity for being re-edited and used for a variety of purposes because of the sort of film it is, which is also interesting. That may be well beyond the limits of our discussion, but it's certainly an issue.
If I could just make one very short comment, I may be the only person in the room who's actually seen the film. I actually was just in the United States, and because I have very close contacts and very close connections with the evangelical community, I felt that it was my responsibility to go with them to see the film. And just very briefly, I think that anyone who has been involved for any length of time with interfaith connections, communication, certainly this is my response, has got a devastating sense of failure in that the two sides, it seems, have been talking past each other, because each side has not understood the central passion of the other side. We have not understood fully the Christian passion for the passion, and they have not understood, the Christian world has not understood our horrendous sense of passion for our 2,000 years culminating in the Holocaust. And it seems that that is something that we need to reevaluate and learn from each other. We have not understood the central passion of each faith community. And just a question, I was devastated, Father, to hear your comments that you were told by Hebrew speakers of an absolutely indecent and unacceptable assault on Christianity that appeared in the Israeli press. And I wanted to ask you, are you aware of this? Have you read about this? Do you know where it's coming from? And what can we as a society
talk radio
in Israel? Oh, and if this is true, what do we as a society do about that? That's not acceptable. Is something wrong?
Dr. Skonefeld here is working with a Christian, working with Israeli and Palestinian educators about how we teach about the other. When Pope John Paul II came here, one persons in the Ministry of Education said, so why do we have to change? There's the Inquisition, the Crusades, and the Holocaust. What else is there? And I think that that kind of mindset needs to be changed, but some of it can be changed with experience and education. And he's working on a project precisely of how we can teach about the other so that the other can recognize him or herself in that teaching. And that hasn't happened yet, but it's one part of it.
If I may, ever since the discussion about the film started, I remembered something I once heard. For the first millennium or more, Christianity, most of the public were illiterate. They couldn't read their Gospels. And they learned mostly from the art in the cathedrals. Now, when the Roman Emperor adopted Christianity and his descendants, they didn't want to blame the Romans. So it's so natural, it was so easy to blame the Jews. Because to show in the French Revolution, when the decapitation couldn't be hidden from the people, but it was in a different section. At that time, that's part of it.
I think the observation that most Christians got their education through artwork is a very important insight. I think there's been a lot of work done on that, and it needs to be brought to our attention over and over again about the potency of art as a teaching tool.
This is mostly for Reverend McGarry. First of all, I want to congratulate you for doing a wonderful job, and for being very, very brave and admitting that not every word is really the gospel truth, which brings me to the fact that for a majority of believing Christians, certainly the evangelicals, every word is the gospel truth, and you cannot change a word. But I would just like you to comment on the following. Certain passages from the New Testament, like the Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer, are all Jewish expressions from our Torah. And it would be wonderful if in a new edition of the Bible, it would be commentary which would stress where this all originated. Because again, the majority of Christians are now aware of to what extent they should be indebted to the Jews and for Jewish sources. And then, of course, there is the story which has changed so very often that the Christianity of Constantine is completely different, 180 degrees from the original gospel of the Jewish disciples of Jesus. Perhaps you'd like to comment. Thank you very, very much.
Concerning the first point, that the Sermon on the Mount and others are within, I would say differently from you. They're within the spectrum of Jewish teaching of that Second Temple period, and therefore Jesus was not a Christian teaching Christianity to Jews, but a Jew teaching from a place within the spectrum of Jewish views. I think the work of David Flusser of this university is very important in that regard. But it's not simply Judaism that he was teaching. I think there was a difference insofar as there was a recommendation to Gibson that he end his film from an evangelical Christian, end his film with, at the time of Jesus, 250,000 Jews were crucified by Pontius Pilate, but only one was raised from the dead. There is a significant difference between what Christians affirm about Jesus and what Jews can affirm about the teachings of Jesus. And there has been people who have tried to, one, make Jesus so different from his Jewish past that it's incomprehensible how he could have been a Jew in the first century. But I think there's on the other side is the problem of making Jesus not unique or not special. One has to ask, well, why would one be a follower of Jesus at all? With regard to the second question about it was a 180-degree change from the time of Jesus to the time of Constantine, I don't agree with that. I think that that's a misrepresentation, misunderstanding, particularly if one understands that, from a Christian perspective, that the teachings of Jesus are not simply in stone someplace and then that's the perfect time and everything since then has been getting away from it or a devolution of it, but rather that there is a growing or development of teaching. One might even make the comparison with Judaism. Is everything in the Old Testament or is everything in Talmud? And talking with my Jewish colleagues, most of the time that they quote from the Talmud to explain to me Jewish thought and Jewish teaching. But I can say, well, isn't that a deterioration from what's really the Bible truth? I think that we need to understand the other's way of developing into where we are today, and I think that for me as a Catholic is also a work of the Holy Spirit. And so I don't want to be mystifying, but I think that characterization you made of it is something I'd like to agree with.
If I could just jump in and second in some way Father McGarry's point there. In general, we tend to make too much of Constantine and the Christianization of the Roman Empire. That isn't the turning point in the history of early Christianity, maybe a turning point in the sense of the political fortunes of the Roman Empire and in various other ways, but we make too much sometimes of, or tend to want to believe that somehow Christianity changed at that moment, and it didn't. This was a slowly evolving process, as Prof said. I think one of the most important points here, and which I tried to touch on even briefly in my own comments, was the extent to which Catholic tradition, as it evolves, as it has evolved over the last 40 years, as a tradition, and not simply as a personal understanding of this individual or that, but as an understanding of the church and individuals working within the church, has been a remarkable, and I think a remarkably brave attempt to come to terms with enormous problems and enormous difficulties within Christian history. What's so disturbing about the movie, and many things being said about the movie, is an attempt essentially to set back more than 40 years of ethic and traditional thought that is thought within a tradition about Jewish-Christian relations. Just and if I could just add in a sentence, I know there are questions out there. One of the more disturbing things that one sees as soon as one goes on the internet and begins not only to go to the main site, but to follow discussion groups, to go to the blogs of various sorts and see how people are talking about the movie, is that in fact the attacks on Jewish critics of the movie, which I focused on earlier, are in fact a small, very small minority of attacks out there. The really vociferous, and I would say in some ways hateful stuff, is what's being written by Christians about Christian scholars, about Christian professors, about Christians who are involved in ecumenical work. I mean, that I find, and that may be to a certain extent an inner Christian or inner Catholic problem, but it's one that should concern us all, certainly all of us who are in any way involved or concerned with ecumenical relations in faith dialogue. Yeah, I think, at least to the extent that I've seen, yes, it's an American thing, but casting a deep aspersions on those scholars, some of whom are members of the Christian study group, but essentially on Christian scholars who voiced criticism of the movie. And that seems to be, in a certain sense, in a long range, perhaps a more worrying phenomenon.
Would like to make a few comments at this point. I've listened carefully and quietly to this discussion, but let me reassure the lady. I have actually seen the film, which puts me in a rather delicate position. I've actually seen it twice, which is even worse. The first time was in Jerusalem at a private showing, and strictly speaking, you could say it was an illegal showing, but I won't go into that. It was a very poor quality. And then last week, I was in Montreal for an international conference, which incidentally, there was one session that was devoted to this issue, and I will say a word about that in a moment. But I saw it in Montreal on the big screen. Canada is not the United States, and the hall was 1/3 full, 2/3 empty, and there was no visible reaction at all. So obviously, even that small fact suggests to me reactions will be very different in countries around the world. But I participated in the discussion in Montreal with two distinguished scholars on this question. One was Daniel Goldhagen, the other was referred to twice by Father McGarry, James Carroll. And then subsequently, it so happened I took the shuttle from Montreal to Boston after the conference, and I was sitting next to James Carroll, whom I know, and we spent 90% of the following hour just discussing our respective impressions. And as Father McGarry indicated, James Carroll, who is a liberal Catholic, the author of Constantine's Sword, and is vocal on issues of Jewish, Catholic, Jewish-Christian dialogue. Father James Carroll believes, indeed, that this is an obscene film. I wouldn't go quite so far, but I think that it is a devastating film. in a number of ways. One thing which hasn't been said, but I think makes it even more devastating, is that it's aesthetically powerful. Actually, it shows that Mel Gibson, whatever else may have been said about him, has talent as a filmmaker, which brings over, if you don't like the message of the film, and I didn't, and that's an understatement, it makes it even more difficult to bear. I couldn't help being reminded of something I saw 40 years ago. Some of you may remember, I was then just a student, but I was still just out of school. But you may remember the American Jewish comedian, Lenny Bruce, the master of the sick joke. Exactly 40 years ago, I believe. He had a story which sort of encapsulates it from a Jewish perspective. An act about a Jew who was thoroughly weary, not only of being called a Christ killer, but of being punched in the mouth by the disciples of the Prince of Peace. So finally, this beleaguered Jew puts a note in the cellar where he knows it's going to be easily found, because he wanted to absolve all the Jews, all the other Jews, right? And the note said, "I did it, Morty." And this was one of Lenny Bruce's last jokes before he was tried and sentenced for obscenity, and he died not long afterwards. The tragedy is, of course, that even Jews saying "I did it" wouldn't help very much. The charge of deicide, and that's really what I wanted to add to this discussion at this point, because we are a centre for the study of anti-Semitism, and because this is one of the issues that we have to consider. There are many other things, and I'm glad they've been alluded to this morning, because it was very important to hear how practicing Catholics and Christians might view this film, and what issues it raises for them. But I think for Jews, the overwhelming issue, not the only one, but the overwhelming one, is the sheer weight of the deicide charge that the Jews murdered Christ, that the Jews killed God, and so on. And in looking at this film, both in Jerusalem, where it was even more intense experience, and at a greater distance in North America, I feel that whatever the intention, and I don't claim to be a mind reader, what was in Mel Gibson's mind, whatever the intentions, the potential of this film in one blow to unravel almost 40 years now of a process of change, of moving forward in the Jewish-Christian dialogue, and the consequences of Nostra of releasing the Jewish people from the burden of collective responsibility and guilt for the death of Jesus. And this film, whatever the intentions of the filmmaker, has taken us back into a pre-Vatican II world. The cumulative effect, and that's how I saw it, as I believe almost all Jews will see it. Not all Jews, because I know some are on record as vehemently denying it. But I believe the majority of Jews will see it that way. And possibly a minority of Christians. That, in effect, the Romans carry out the crucifixion. That is shown in all its sadistic, gory detail. The Roman soldiers, in particular, are presented as cruel, vicious. They can't get enough of it once they begin to scourge Jesus. But the point is, who drives them to do it? the brains behind this terrible action. It is clearly, free, a free man. The incitement to indict Jesus comes from the Jewish leaders. It comes in particular from the high priest. And the depiction of those Jews is unequivocally evil. You are meant to feel, you do feel, that they represent evil. Likewise, the Jewish mob that is shown baying for Jesus' blood, crucify him, crucify him. I felt this went way over what the gospel accounts indicate. Pontius Pilate, I was really shocked to see a depiction that I thought, after all the many important things that have been said in the last 3 decades or so, including by many Catholics and Protestants, the guidelines that have been set out, to see once more a version of the Roman governor of Palestine, more or less like a pussycat, following obediently the dictates of both of the leaders and the Jewish leaders and of the mob. To see also one of the most insidious things that I noticed in this movie, and I think a number of critics have referred to it, is the presence of the devil, of Satan, very cleverly, artistically presented as it's the face of a woman, but a woman with androgynous characteristics. Appears about 4 times in the film, and always appears in crucial moments. And the most insidious to me is the scene of crucify him, when Pontius Pilate clearly wants to spare Jesus. He's been scourged. He says, "What more do you want?" And he thinks that the bloodlust of the crowd will have been satisfied. And then you see this androgynous Satan moving in the crowd and creating this impression of evil in their midst. And it's impossible not to have an association with the Jews in that context, at least for me. And I don't understand how it is. Frankly, this is still an enigma to me, according to the many reports, particularly evangelical Christians who have come out of this movie, and have said they didn't see it. They did not see any element of anti-Jewishness. What could be the explanation? I'm sort of mystified. Could it be, as Father McGarry suggested at one point, that a Christian comes to view this movie from such a different starting point that this will be judged by many Christians as, is it a vindication of my faith in Jesus? And everything else is so secondary that it's like a blind spot, that the depiction of the Jews is simply not seen. Is it because we live, or particularly in the United States, where most of the reactions we had so far have been reported from there, that the overall context, the cultural context, is such that American Christianity, whether Protestant or Catholic, is less burdened with an anti-Jewish history, so therefore there is not the sort of reflex, almost knee-jerk associations with Jews, the devil, evil, Christ killers, to the same degree. Is it something else? I don't know. This part of it leaves me perplexed. What I do sense, and here I want to conclude with this, that just to relate a couple of points that came out during that discussion I had with James Carroll on the shuttle to Boston. he expressed to me, and I must say I share his concern, but it goes even deeper than mine, I think, on this issue. He said to me, I feel that this film is actually the final, and there's no, pun intended, but the final nail, maybe, in the coffin of the 50-year period in which the Western world made an effort of sorts to internalize the meaning of the Holocaust. He saw the film in the context of the Holocaust as Christian, which is very interesting to me. Because what he was saying, in effect, is that as long as this held true, broadly speaking, then there was a certain barrier to anti-Semitism in the Western world, reviving some of its most potent archetypes. But what has been happening, for all kinds of reasons that don't go way beyond this discussion, is that has been eroded in many quarters. And now comes this film, the beginning of a new millennium, which in itself is a whole subject of discussion, what that means. Now comes this film. And whatever, again, it's not to do with what were the conscious intentions of the filmmaker. But in a way it's saying, you want to see real suffering, you want to see real agony, you want to see real torture, I'm going to show it to you. I'm going to show you Jesus on his way to the cross and then being crucified. And guess who done it? That's the unconscious level. And that's what James Carroll shared with me, and it's a chilling thought.
One very specific question. You said at the beginning of your things that the movie is actually good, and my sole consolation in all this commotion has been, without having seen the film, that it's probably a very bad film, and why I think that what Gibson intended to do is to become a filmmaker rather than a theologist, historian, philosopher, etc. And that the fact that we've been having these academic discussions about the film seems even a bit absurd to me. So could you please elaborate just a few words about why you thought that the film is actually so good and so powerful? As a film, not
You're asking me about the aesthetic?
Yes. Why you thought the film is so good?
I didn't suggest it's so good. I said it was aesthetically powerful, and that it showed that the filmmaker had an eye for, very telling effects, and that, that relates to something that was hinted at by Father McGarry, but that we know from the Catholic tradition, the importance of art in that tradition is enormous. And I think great trouble was taken to capture certain tones, certain reconstruction in cinematic terms as not necessarily authentic, but the settings in Italy, although they were shot in Italy, they seem very convincing in terms of having a feel for what the scenes might have looked like, and also the choice of actors and the way they're directed and the way they played. And it was particularly difficult for me to watch the Scourging of Jesus, because it so happens that the actor who plays the role looks exactly like my son. So, I was in a really unpleasant situation, particularly at the moment of the crucifixion. The Father, why hast thou forsaken me? It's very personal. And really, no, I mean, this actually is true. It's curious because Father McGarry touched on it. It's a very interesting point, how in Western art, Jesus is so often seems like a Renaissance Italian or a, Aryan German, blue-eyed, blonde-haired, pale figure. In this film, he doesn't. He looks like a good-looking Jew, I would say, from that time, and with long hair, a bit of a sort of hippie type. And the actor does it very well. Very convincing. Less convincing is the Aramaic. But I think that for Hebrew-speaking audiences in this country, that would be an extraordinary experience to listen to Jesus in Aramaic. And I'm not quite sure whether this makes it all more authentic or not, but it makes it different from all other representations. Although there's one very strange moment when there is this personal encounter between Pontius Pilate and Jesus, and you are led to understand that Jesus spoke and understood Latin. Now, I'm not sure historically, that doesn't seem right to me. And we don't hear any Greek, so it's Latin and Aramaic. So authenticity is not perfect, but never mind. It is visually strong. But I think that makes it worse from the point of view. Yeah.
I'd like just to add something that Father McGarry touched upon in his subsequent remarks. It was reported in the American press that I believe it was maybe in Fox, I'm not sure, had asked Mel Gibson to put in a statement at the end of the film that the Romans crucified 250,000 Jews, only one rose from the dead. My question to either you, Father McGarry, or Professor, is, to me at least, I think I know just a little history. I never read before heard that there were 250,000 Jews that were crucified by the Romans. I wonder if that's factually correct. Is it a historical fact for that 250,000 Jews were crucified?
I probably read some of the same things, and they claimed that that was historically true, but to read it in a magazine article or a newspaper that this is historically true, I think it's incumbent upon me to go back and check the sources, because it does seem like an awfully large figure. But the point is made whether it's 40,000 or 250,000.
The other point I don't know if this is relevant now, but my also understanding was that as far as the times are concerned, that the only reference to Jesus at the time, the gospel, the earliest gospel, I think was written 50 years later, was in Josephus. Josephus refers to somebody in the War of the Jews causing problems, causing sort of like like a revolutionary character, if you will, a radical, I think, of his time. And I was just wondering if that's also your understanding, Father McGarry, that that's the only reference to Jesus at the time.
No, there are other references in particular.
Yeah.
Not many, but there are.
I'd like to ask Father McGarry a question about Vatican II. I'd like to begin with Schwach. It can be said for the Catholic Church that at least they came out with Vatican II, whereas other Christian denominations did not. But I want to ask the question, if he does not think that the time has come to make a great quantum leap from Vatican II. Most people who speak about Vatican II very glibly do not know what is written, but they are under the impression that Vatican II, in the version of the Jews and the Elephant, is all about Jews, all about anti-Semitism, all about the SI charge. The small chapter relating to anti-Semitism at Vatican II is a small chapter which also involves relations with other religions, and it's far less, say, shorter than the chapter on church music or the chapter on church architecture. The 40 words out of 500 pages, the 40 words out of 500 pages dealing with the deicide charge say, although it is true that not all the Jews of the time supported the Jewish leaders, in other words, there were certainly many, we cannot hold the Jewish the Jews of today responsible. To a certain degree, this reinforces the deicide charge, no question about it. Now, when I read that the depictions of Jesus' passion in the past, I'm quoting from the document you put out, you and Rabbi Kronish, have sometimes fermented Jew hatred, isn't that for really saying, an amazing understatement? If you're quoting James Carroll before, James Carroll in his book, Dante's Short, he says, that indictment, the explicit charge of deicide, remains the ground of all Jewish hatred, and he goes on to quote a couple of pages later, that only the terrible accusation can account for the depth and persistence, and the word persistence, what we see in the world today, in cartoons of La Stampa, and murals in Scottish churches, etc., can account for the persistence of this supreme hatred. So the time has now come, especially seeing that scholarship has accepted that so much in the gospel, especially being the passion story, is polemical and can be regarded as being the individual ideas of the evangelists and not, as we would in our religion call Torah Sinai. If the time has not come, at the very least, to do what, if I may quote from a book Father Martin Beck, on called Christianity in the 21st Century, says that in every edition of the New Testament, where you have certain problematic verses, they must both be in small type, and next to them must be what we would call a Perush Rashi. There must be the interpretations. For example, if you see Matthew 27:25, his blood be upon us, that next to a text like that it should be emphasized that this is apparently Matthew's own version, doesn't appear in any of the other Gospels, and in general to deal with this, because if you still have this persistence of this hatred, it means that no matter how great a step, and unfortunately the saintly man, Pope John 23, was unable to finish the work that he did, that has Vatican II and the Nostra Aetate have not been enough. And that there must now be some radical addition, some radical change in the way that Christian version of the Passion story is presented to the Christian community at large, not just in discussions but amongst theologians and discussions between Roy and Alice Eckhart on the one hand and John Crossan on the other, but must be made available to the general Christian community.
That's not a question, it's a statement.
Well, yeah, thank you for that very illuminating comment. I'm sure we would all agree that is required.
I think it's actually, I think it's a distortion of what's happening. So I could take each comment if you want me to, which would be another 20 minutes in addition to your comments, but let me just say this. Vatican Council II, thank goodness, didn't say more than it did, precisely because it was a change. It's the only part of this Second Vatican Council that doesn't have footnotes to our history. One has to understand in the Catholic Church it's very important to connect with our tradition. And this is one of the few places where there's a real change, because there's not simply something new. I sometimes quip that the Catholic Church ever to ordain women, the first lines of the statement would be, as we have always taught. Because in the Catholic Church we have to connect, but if one looks at those statements, there's nothing in the footnotes about the past. So we had to have the guidelines of 1975. We had to have the notes on the correct way to preach and teach about Judaism and the Jewish people in 1985. We had to have the We Remember document in 1998 with all its problems. We had to have a whole book full of statements by Pope John Paul II over and over again about the Shoah, about the importance of the unmasking the anti-Judaism in the New Testament and so forth. And for you to say that's all that's happened in the last 20 years, I think it's a real distortion with the history of the Catholic Church is. Furthermore, I think that the Catholic Church is not the only church in the world. We have done what we've tried to do, and what we've done in our catechisms is regularly had rabbis and other Jewish educators help us teach about the Jews. Now, I'd like to see you point out what the other groups have done, the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Lutherans. And so, if you're going to say the church and the Christian church, and don't make those distinctions, I think that's a distortion. I think all the people who listen to you think that what you said is the truth, and it's not the truth, it's a distortion. And I think it was very unfair what you said. And that's why I didn't want to comment on it, because it's simply a polemic, and it wasn't Martin Beck, it's Norman Beck, and he has certain ways of reason of doing for that. But we have a problem with our scriptures, as you have a problem with your scriptures, and we need to work on those. The book of Joshua is not a helpful book in the current situation, but we need to deal with it. You need to deal with it, we need to deal with it. And if you're not willing to change that, I don't think it's fair for me to say that you're simply an imperialist or colonialist. And therefore, I think that what you just said to me is the same sort of polemic I don't find helpful.
Very good.
Reading about the movie in the criticism, there's a great deal of interest about the impact of the movie, or lack of impact on Jews. That was found fascinating. The movie has been extremely popular among evangelicals. Are there any theological issues in the movie that affect Catholicism vis-a-vis evangelical or Protestant approaches to Christianity? Is this present a theological challenge to Catholicism?
I think you're right to point out the difference between evangelical and evangelical Protestantism and Catholic responses to the movie, because there is, when I lived in the South in the United States, I used to joke that I would be confronted by evangelical Christians who would say, in one breath and in one word, do you believe in Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior? And would say, no, I'm a Catholic. They would laugh, because that confirmed all the prejudice about Catholics. In the Protestant and evangelical world, there's a very keen sense of Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior who did this for me. And I'm told by those who have seen the film and by reviewers that there are many times cinematically that I think Dr. Wistrich is very wise to underscore, when the eye looks at you, Jesus is dying for you, and you're looking there, and all of a sudden, this is me that he's doing it for. And Catholics don't quite have that same edge to a handle to the way they respond to the Passion, although we Catholics do have the Stations of the Cross. But I think that if one goes in, either as a Catholic or Protestant, with however we deal with the Passion, is so different from the way a Jew would go into it, who might go in with the question, is this anti-Semitic, will never feel a touch. And I don't think they can. And I don't think Catholic Christians can ever feel the weight of the history of Christian anti-Semitism as the way a Jew does. And that's why we need to talk with one another. And why we need, as Jews and Christians who know the history, like James Carroll and I, need to ruin the movie for other Christians to say, you see how they use stock, if this is the case, how they use stock anti-Semitic stereotypes and characters to foment the anti-Jewish, and the Romans are simply foils for the anti-Jesus Jews, which I trust Dr. Wistrich's perceptions.
Yeah, that will be the last question. Just a footnote to that remark. One of the things I found intriguing, both in the recorded answers given by Mel Gibson and a number of interviews, and also the impression that comes out of the movie, is that although he is a Catholic, in many respects, his vision, as it were, of salvation is much closer to that evangelical Protestant tradition. Very, Jesus as my personal Savior, and this is the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, and although he claims to be speaking in the name of Catholic tradition, and an authentic Catholic tradition going back beyond and before Vatican II, I think this is highly questionable, and a number of scholars have pointed to the ways in which this is questionable, that the supposed fidelity to the text of the Gospels ignores so much of what Christian scholarship, as well as Jewish scholarship, has demonstrated about the context of the Gospels and many other things. All this has been disregarded in a way that seems to me obviously strikes great chord with the vast sway of Protestant Christianity in America in particular, but not only there probably. And some Catholics too appear to have been very taken with this. I can't really comment on that, why this is the case, but it does seem disturbing, I think, when you actually get to see the film. Anyway, one last question.
I'm not a student of anti-Semitism, I'm a victim of anti-Semitism. So my question is not so much the academic background of the dialogue between Christianity and Judaism, and therefore my question is practically. First of all, I would like to know if you already know knowledge about the Islamic reaction to this film. Is there is there something going on? If one sees the internet on this subject, how are they reacting? Because I view anti-Semitism as a ticking bomb of mass destruction. So it might be interesting to know how the discussion between Jews and Christianity is going on towards this film, but I think whatever it is, it endangers our existence, especially if one thinks about the recent past and the late past. But I think a very interesting indication might be if one would monitor the reaction in the Islamic world.
It's my guess that there will be some in the radical Islamic movements who will latch on to traditional Christian anti-Semitic assertions and bromides. And give one example, although he's not particularly practicing, is Bashar al-Assad, when he spoke at the papal visit to Syria. He brought out a whole series of traditional anti-Semitic, Christian anti-Semitic charges that were, not only were they sick, they were embarrassing that they were so blatant. And I suspect that there may be a use of some traditional anti-Semitic dimensions to that one could draw from the film by some Islamic movements. I think that's why it's all the more important that not only that we think that we need to all live together somehow, be in dialogue with our Muslim brothers and sisters to talk about how these are problematic dimensions of our Christian scriptures, but also what a terrible effect these have had on the Jewish people over the years, and that they don't represent how Christians are understanding their faith today. So I think that it impels us, it should impel us more towards discussion with our Muslim brothers and sisters, as well as our discussion with our Jewish brothers and sisters in this land, which I think is also very ripe for some new understandings about the other.
Are you aware that Arafat reportedly saw the movie and says that what the Jews did to Jesus, they are now doing to the Palestinians? If that report is correct.
Where did you see that report?
Several places, including the Jerusalem Post of either yesterday or the day before.
Where did they get it from? Arafat said that the Palestinians.
It's nothing new. The Palestinian people is a reincarnation of Jesus Christ. And the killers of Jesus repeat. Until this morning, repeated traditional Islamic allegations that the Jews are a people of the killers of the prophets. And the prophet, the main prophet, which Islamic tradition brings in this respect, is Jesus Christ.
But
Yes, indeed.
character has said several times that Jesus was a Palestinian.
It's not that these statements have been made. Regrettably, we live in a part of the world with so much violence. That this rather sensationalized version of a medieval passion play is going to, it's going to add yet another more archaic layer, but it obligates us even more to persist in trying to unravel these issues. As Father McGarry has said, we need to widen that dialogue. And perhaps, who knows, God's ways are strange, this will be a vehicle that we could turn, paradoxically, into a way to put on the table many issues which come up with almost frightening resonance, and therefore obligate us to deal with issues that many had thought were perhaps behind us, and we see are very much in the present. It just remains for me to sincerely thank Father McGarry for having come and shared with us his thoughts and reflections. I think it's important for us to hear that, and thank you very much for doing it.